You mentioned that the current system perpetrates or perpetuates coercive control. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, so, I mean, what's happening in coercive control, I think it can be really helpful to understand, first of all, what tools are being used by the controller. So the controller is using they're really well described, and what they do is they start with a pattern of making you trust them, making you love them, making you think that, they're these really wonderful people, and that's the goal of a controller right at the beginning, and they convince the woman that they're actually better than they deserve. And it's even more effective of a tool if the abuser can make everyone around them think that they are also really wonderful people too. And then what they do is they try to make the person dependent on them. So that's where they start to break down all the support networks that she might have. So that's banning her friends directly, or by saying that her friends are not trustworthy and turning her against the people in her life, isolating her from her family, and then sort of introducing the financial dependence on him by not allowing her to work or giving her an allowance. And that sort of behaviour is insidious and it's slow to build up, but it's actually seen in all of these patterns. And once we all start to see it and describe it more easily, I think that's when you can start to build up a case for what's going on in the relationship. Then you have to if you're the controller, you have to make the person believe that they are completely dependent on you and that they would never survive without them. So beyond being financially dependent on them, it's this sort of slipping in of derogatory remarks, and it starts off again like a little bit, how ugly they are, how stupid they are, and then that increases more and more as her self-esteem deteriorates further. The controller wants the person to be fearful of them, or of a consequence, so not necessarily a physical consequence, but of a consequence. So there's these ongoing threats to the woman as well as her children and her family, and then a punishment that comes with that. And then that behaviour, as it's going on, it's causing it's an ongoing injury. And so what's happening to her on a biological level is what happens to any animal under threat. And it's a state of hypervigilance, which is orchestrated by the nervous system, high levels of cortisol. And so in the face of that predator, she tries to get into his mind to understand what she has to do to keep him happy and to stop him from hurting her further. And so she's trying desperately to think of what she needs to do to avoid getting hurt herself or her children getting hurt. And so controllers, they use really simple conditioning methods. So she's rewarded for behaviour that he likes, I'm so glad you're not like those other women, and then punished for behaviours that he doesn't like. Why are you wearing that? You look disgusting. So after a while, her own needs and desires become lost because she's too busy trying to survive by meeting his. And where he ends and she starts, it begins to blur. So these are really normal responses to trauma, and I think it's a big failure that we can't see that. So for the rest of us, when we're looking at that, we can see, why does this person keep going back to somebody who's beaten her and can't quite understand what's going on, and think, there's not a lot of point in helping somebody like this. But this ongoing behaviour, it results in the victim being in a state of constant checking and assessment. And, women in this situation are actually weighing up risks every single day, all of the time. It's an ongoing process. It's, thinking of the risks of everyday activities like choosing what to wear or whether the food's got enough, the food's right, or she's chewing too loudly, that kind of thing, to big things like what might happen if she might leave. So what we see clinically is identical to what we see in first responders and the defence personnel with PTSD. It's exactly the same. These women are operating using their primal brain. They lose their creativity, executive function is impaired, there's poor sleep. You don't want to sleep if there's a predator in the room. You get restless, distractibility. The symptoms are exactly the same, except that you don't really call it post-traumatic stress disorder because they haven't yet left the war zone. So what happens when you asked before, you mentioned, how do we we continue or how are we complicit in that? So she's already in a state of hypervigilance in her own relationship. But then you've got to remember that the backdrop here is that we are in a safe, modern country, but every single week in the media she'll be reading a story of a woman exactly like herself who is murdered, set on fire, run off a bridge or stabbed. So that's what she's seeing. And hearing that almost all of those stories, those women have also tried to get help and how they've tried to leave and how it's her fault because she's tried to deprive him of the children. So you've got this sort of background level of anxiety caused just by the media itself. And she fears she's going to be killed, and you and everybody in this room knows this, because she really might be killed. That is a real risk. So she has to run through every possibility of escaping this. At the same time that she's dealing with him, she's looking at how can she go out into a world that is actually really very unsafe as well. Even if she wants to run away and go into hiding, our system could attack her and accuse her of kidnapping her own child. Then she has to think about child protection. Should she call them and ask for help? But if she calls for help, they might remove her children. Or if she doesn't call for help, they might remove her children. So which one does she do? And then she's got to think about going to the police. If she goes to the police, will they charge him? Because a quarter of the time, that's all, is the time that they will charge him. And we all know this. Women get to know that this is going to happen. Then even if the charges are actually laid, a third of the time they'll be dropped. And then even if it goes to court, you're talking about 10% of these men might get found guilty. And even if they are found guilty, less than 2% are going to go to jail for that. And even if they go to jail, less than 2% will do the whole course. So is it worth all of that and making more of an enemy? Because these are an act of aggression, right? If you report your partner, you are being aggressive back to them. You're going to inflame the anger that they've already got. And even if they get an AVO, the family law court can override the AVO as well. So, the family law court, that's fraught. And, I'm sure other people have spoken about that or will speak to that. But again, even the questions around that for women is, do I tell the court that he's beating our children as well? Because if she does, she'll get accused of being a parental alienator. But if she doesn't, then Child Protection says she's not doing a good enough job of protecting her children. So it's this constant state of going, I've got an enemy at home, but the whole system is also an enemy as well.